Hi everyone, my name is Sean Betts. I'm a senior at Bloomsburg University, and I made this presentation for a world politics class about Donald Trump and the potential impacts for the world. Now, I'm not taking sides in this presentation. I'm merely presenting information about the potential impacts for Americans and the world based off of President-elect Trump's 100-day plan that he released towards the end of October, as reported on by NPR, Forbes, and PolitiFact, and also taking into account topics discussed throughout the course of this class and this semester. I'm going to do that by breaking it down into four categories: what a Trump presidency could potentially mean for the citizen, the worker, the environment, and the world. Okay, so here we go with part one, which is what are the potential impacts of a Trump presidency for the American citizen? And again, this is based off of President-elect Trump's own 100-day plan that his campaign had released back in October. So one of the first things that I'm sure we've all seen in the media throughout this election cycle is Donald Trump's promise to, quote-unquote, drain the swamp. This is his way of saying he wants to clean up the mess that has become our nation's capital. This is most certainly reflected in his 100-day plan. One of the first things he wants to do is make term limits for congressmen. It isn't hard to see why this would be a good thing. I mean, in today's rapidly changing world, public consciousness and opinions shift almost as fast as the rest of the world, technology and everything else. Due to this, it's almost crazy to think that the same people represent the public interest for an essentially endless amount of terms as it currently is. While this would be great for the average citizen, since Trump's election, the Senate has essentially said that this will not be happening. And I mean, why would they want it to? They can serve an endless number of terms. Why would they want to take that away from themselves? Next on President-elect Trump's to-do list is to cancel out anything that he can that was passed by President Obama. Probably the first thing that comes to most people's minds here is Obamacare, or the Affordable Care Act. Trump here is no different. President Trump and the Republican Party in general have had a bad taste in their mouth ever since Obamacare came into effect, so it should really come as no surprise that they want to get rid of it. The question here becomes, how will this affect things like inequality? Most people either love Obamacare or hate it. There's no in between. But when you look at the facts, while it made a lot of people's premiums go way up, it also extended health care to literally thousands of people who couldn't previously obtain it. If you take that away, where does that leave us? We're almost back at square one. Another thing to note here is that since the election, Trump has already backtracked on his campaign-long promise to flat-out repeal Obamacare, and has instead stated his plans to fix it in some way that he has yet to specify. Another of President Obama's actions that Trump, throughout his campaign, has promised to nullify is an order that protected the children of illegal immigrants from Mexico. Donald Trump wants to take that protection away. To some citizens here, that's a good thing, as these people are not legally permitted to be here in the first place, or their parents weren't, so why should they be allowed to? To others, this creates the worry of an atmosphere of fear and hate towards certain groups. You know, it calls back to things like internment camps back during World War II, that sort of thing. As such, this could really go either way as far as being a good thing or a bad thing, assuming he is actually able to do this. After all, the way our government's set up, due to the system of checks and balances, it's not like he can just walk in on day one and change everything by day two, even if he would like to. Another thing on Trump's 100-day plan that will have a tremendous effect on the average citizen, as well as the economy as a whole, is his proposal of the Middle Class Tax Relief and Simplification Act. Naturally, this would require the approval of Congress, but being that everything in D.C. is now majority Republican, that doesn't seem to be too much of a long shot. The idea behind the act does sound pretty tempting. The name says it all. He wants to lower taxes for everyone. Regardless of who you are, what you do, he just wants to lower your taxes. If people pay less taxes, obviously they'll have more money in their pocket to spend, helping the economy. Sounds great to everyone, right? The good folks at NPR and PolitiFact did some digging and fact-checking into this proposed plan, as stated by Trump's campaign, and they found two things. Number one, we'll call it the good news. It would in fact lower taxes for everyone across the board. Good for us citizens, right? The second thing, not so good news. While the plan would help everyone pay lower taxes, it would help the richest of the rich pay by far the biggest drop in taxes. So, it's easy to see how this isn't good for inequality in this country, but I think it's a step in the right direction, and perhaps with some tweaking from his financial advisors, the plan could be made to work down the road. So overall, it would appear Mr. Trump is doing some things to try and help the average U.S. citizen in some ways. While some of these proposals are a little questionable, may or may not be, or not specific enough necessarily to really examine in full, he does at least appear to be trying and making an effort to connect with what the American citizen wants. He does not appear to be what anyone would consider a champion on inequality, however, but people can change. Nobody's perfect. But overall, I think the average American would agree that there need to be some changes made in Washington, some tweaks to our healthcare and immigration laws, just an overall overhaul on tax. And even if you don't specifically agree with how he wants to change it, I think you would agree with those things and that they need to be changed. Alright, so that about wraps it up for part one. I'm going to move on here to part two and how Trump's 100-day plan here is going to have an effect for the workers in this country. So there are a few things outlined and or proposed in the new President-elect's 100-day plan that will have an impact on the workers of this country. One of the first things, and I mean literally, it's actually one of the first things listed in his plan, is a hiring freeze for all federal employees. Now, this is all federal employees with the exception of military and public health and public safety officials. This probably, at least in part, comes from the Republican Party's ambition to have an overall smaller federal workforce. According to NPR's Washington correspondent Brian Naylor, they wanted to shrink it by as much as 10%. Naturally, this would impact the workforce in a few ways. First, what happens to all the people who aspired to be or are going to school to be a federal employee for whatever reason, be it the benefits or just their childhood dream for whatever reason? These people won't have these jobs and therefore won't be buying anything supporting the economy. Also, what happens if a situation arises where, for whatever reason, a federal branch of something absolutely needs to be expanded for some emergency purpose? A big factor here as it relates to the worker is Trump's proposal to renegotiate and, if necessary, leave NAFTA. Now, for those of you who don't know or are too young to remember, NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement that came about under President Clinton back in the 90s, and it basically links the economies of the United States, Canada, and Mexico. This could be pretty much a two-edged sword, like many of Trump's other 100-day proposals, but really that's not a knock at Trump. Anything political could really have the description of a two-edged sword. You got to take the good with the bad. But there's no shortage of critics of NAFTA who think it's stealing money away from American businesses and thus American workers. In that mindset, it's a no-brainer to renegotiate or walk away from NAFTA. It would force all this quote-unquote stolen money back into our economy and our economy alone, not the economies of Canada, Mexico, and us as a three-way split. However, there's a flip side. It's been a long time since NAFTA came into effect, and as such, it isn't likely going to go away. It's just been in effect for too long. It's not really on the top of anybody's list to go ahead and get away, except for Trump, maybe. Also, there's a lot of businesses who since have learned to deal with the new economic collaboration of NAFTA and have actually begun to profit from it. To change that situation today would then be taking money away from them. So where do you draw the line of fairness here? Perhaps some sort of middle ground could be reached, but the plan as far as Trump is concerned is to just do away with NAFTA completely. Also, in that same kind of vein, Trump also wants to withdraw completely from another hot topic, the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the TPP is basically NAFTA on steroids. As such, they share a lot of the same criticisms as far as hurting the American worker and our economy. People believe it allows foreign companies to take advantage of us and shady American companies to do things like dodge taxes. The TPP does not seem to be a very popular item among anyone outside of the smear of the political actors who stand to benefit from it passing. As such, I think it's safe to say most people would support the new president in this endeavor, as it would keep jobs and currency in our country, not foreign nations, thus helping the workers here and our workforce in general. Another thing that probably comes to everyone's mind when thinking about or discussing the workforce is the minimum wage. We hear about it almost every day, be it on social media, in the news, in public. People are always talking about the minimum wage. Some people think it isn't high enough, some think it's too high, or that we maybe shouldn't even have one at all. Some states in the nation have already actually increased it way above and beyond what everybody else is thinking about. At the end of the day, though, there are some legitimate pros and cons to both sides of this argument. But at the end of the day, also, one thing that's undoubtedly true is that the current minimum wage has not increased uniformly with the increased cost of living, which makes it tough for many Americans to make ends meet. In that respect, a higher minimum wage would obviously be very beneficial to a lot of workers, especially on the lower end of the class system here in America. Mr. Trump, however, hasn't really come flat out and made any announcements as far as his position on this issue. Throughout his campaign, he has flip-flopped back and forth between sides. According to an article from Forbes, he's most recently been quoted as saying he feels the minimum wage should be somewhere in the $10 an hour ballpark. Again, he's been pretty wishy-washy on that. Another of Mr. Trump's plans that will affect the workforce in this country is the lifting of current restrictions on energy sources such as oil, shale, natural gas, and coal. As far as job creation is concerned, that would be fantastic. That would do a whole lot of good. The number of jobs in those sectors that would be created would be huge. There are natural resources, stores, and reserves all over this country that companies are just chomping at the bit to get their hands on, and President Trump wants to let them do that. This would reduce dependence on other nations, although only temporarily. I mean, these resources are not permanent or replenishable in any sort of reasonable time frame. Going along with this, Trump said he will greenlight the currently stalled Keystone XL pipeline that was delayed under President Obama. From a strictly job creation standpoint, though, this is fantastic. Again, from an environmental and human rights standpoint, this is catastrophic. But more on that environmental stuff in a little bit. President Trump has also stated in his plans that he plans on focusing resources to fixing and improving our water systems and other infrastructure problems that are in dire need of attention. There's no denying that our nation's infrastructure is literally crumbling beneath our feet, and Trump does plan to help. The only problem here is how he plans to help. He wants to get money to do all this by ceasing to pay money to a United Nations Climate Council that the United States has been a key part of. Again, super good as far as the amount of jobs that will be created to fix a nation's roads and bridges and all the like. It seems Mr. Trump does plan on helping the middle-class working man overall when he is in office, but the question we have to ask ourselves here is at what expense? Just in these last two examples alone I just presented, the answer seemingly is at the expense of the climate and ultimately the environment and the planet, which leads us into the next topic. And that next topic is, for part 3 here, how are Trump's proposed plans potentially going to have an impact on the environment and the planet that we live on? A big issue this day and age is the environment. Are humans harming it? Are we destroying it? Are we not harming it? Is it just naturally shifting over the years like it does? These are all questions you could likely hear on any given day. With the U.S. being as large as it is, we obviously play a huge part in that, as one can imagine. As I started to allude to at the end of the last section, some of Trump's plans also will play a big role in our environmental footprint. This is one place that the president-elect has no shortage of critics in. As I mentioned a little bit ago, he wants to stop payments to the UN Climate Committee. While his reasoning for doing so does make sense, it doesn't really make sense to get the money from here. As one of the leading developed nations in the world, one could really argue that it is our duty to help with something global like the climate as best we can, lead by example. It is true that stopping these payments will not directly result in a global environmental meltdown. The ice caps aren't going to melt tomorrow because Trump stopped these payments. But I think it's fair to say that it's a step in the wrong direction regarding an issue that requires global cooperation now more than ever. Another glaring problem with Trump's proposed plans as it refers to the environment is his ambition to increase the production and use of dirty fuels. Just like above, where his reasons for doing this, job creation and profit creation, makes sense, it's at the expense of the entire world's climate. When you're talking about the climate, we're not just talking about the United States at that point. It's the entire world, and these other countries and foreign nations and other populations are all being affected by the climate. The production of these things is one of the biggest contributors to global warming. This has been proven. Despite this, at a time when the rest of the world is trying to figure out a way to curb these effects, Mr. Trump essentially wants to increase it. Going right along with this, I already stated he wants to greenlight the Keystone XL pipeline. Again, terrible for our environmental footprint. And now this is strictly speculation on my part, But if this did happen, it only seems logical that the currently controversial Dakota Access Pipeline will probably be served a very similar victory over protests. This puts not only the environment at greater risk, but also the health of many Native Americans and others living in that part of the country. And at that point, it almost gets even deeper into being a human rights issue. Everyone's got the right to clean drinking water, the right to live, but it's almost seemingly everyone has the right to clean water until big money and big corporations and big oil get involved. Overall, Mr. Trump's plan shows a willingness. In fact, it's actually one of the actual points on his plan itself to repeal as many federal regulations as possible during his presidency. He's been quoted as saying that for every new regulation that gets passed, they should have to get rid of 2 older ones. There are a couple problems with this, and the first one directly relates to the environment. One of the places that's most likely to feel the cuts of regulations is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to realize why that would be bad for the planet or the environment. On a sort of side note, but kind of related here, it kind of acts as a nice segue into the next section of the presentation here. The housing market crash in 2008 and the repercussions that were felt across the entire globe started in essence due to a lack of regulation. Just sounds eerily similar to a climate like we'd be going into here if we were eliminating 2 older regulations every time we installed a new one. But on that note, let's take a look at the last section here while we're talking about the world. Alright, and that actually is the title of the last section of the presentation here, Part 4, the world. How are Trump's proposed plans going to have an impact globally on foreign nations, on our relationships with foreign nations, that sort of thing. So I feel like I sort of saved the best for last here, talking about how Trump presidency could have an effect on a global scale. After all, we've spent the semester learning about how everything in the modern day is so connected, everything's so globalized, and it's only becoming more so by the day. It only makes sense that new leadership in a country of the scale of the United States would have global implications, and it does. First and foremost, I think it's so important that it's worth another mention, even though I've mentioned it several times already, if everything goes the way Trump planned out in his 100-day plan, we should be slightly concerned about the implications for our climate. Granted, a lot of things can and do and will change, so there's no reason for anyone to panic. But when we're talking about global warming and climate, that sort of thing, it goes way beyond us. It's not just a United States issue, it's a world issue. So finding the money to do it, to make jobs here in the U.S., that doesn't really make sense from a logical standpoint. But anyway, another hot topic from Mr. Trump's campaign that also happens to be discussed in this course's textbook is that of weapons proliferation. We've learned that since the end of the Cold War, steps have been taken to lessen the amount of nuclear weapons on the planet. The impact of a nuclear conflict goes without saying at this point. But Trump has stated a few times on the campaign trail his eagerness to have control of our nuclear arsenal. This may prompt one to ask why, in an era of general disarmament, not everybody, but most people, he would be so eager for such a thing. He's also said on several occasions that he feels more nations should develop or have access to nuclear weapons technology because it is the best way of defense, essentially. So he thinks countries like Japan and South Korea should invest in nuclear technology to help ward off a perceived threat of nuclear invasion from a country like North Korea. This actually even came up during the vice presidential debate, with now Vice President-elect Mike Pence arguing that Trump never made such claims. Spoiler alert, he did, but that's neither here nor there. Regardless, anyone can see the potential global implications of an increase in nuclear weapons. It's just bad news for everyone. We all share this planet. We should be trying to come to some sort of terms or agreement about these things, not pumping them out as fast as we can. There is another issue that essentially everybody's mind goes to when they're thinking about global issues, and that's the issue of terrorism. It only makes sense, being a country that is as militarily mighty as the United States, that our president would take a hardline stance against terrorism, and rightfully so. Trump is no different in this regard. It's no secret to anyone that we are and have been at war for some time. It's no secret what's been going on in places like Syria, even as I make this presentation right now. Luckily for those worried about that, Trump plans on doing everything he can to increase the power of our already basically unstoppable military. He also plans on working well with other foreign leaders to finally defeat ISIS, and this may be where Trump can potentially show a real good side. Critics all over make the argument that the Obama administration, due to some shady dealings and due to conflicts with personal or foreign interests, inadvertently contributed to the creation and arming of ISIS and other similar terrorist sects in the first place. Trump seemingly has no such interests other than stopping the bad guy at the end of the day. This could potentially help him get the job done. May or may not. And also, several notable foreign leaders have already publicly voiced their support of working with Trump in the endeavor of eliminating terrorism and ISIS. These include Vladimir Putin in Russia. This is one somewhat of a pro-Trump presidency, at least for now. While it could prove problematic in the future that he and Trump seem so buddy-buddy, currently it'll help them cooperate. This is great because anyone who's been paying attention knows how high tensions have become in recent weeks between us and Russia over Aleppo in Syria. Hillary Clinton, on the other side, wanted to create a no-fly zone over Syria, which may or may not have ignited an all-out war or fight with Russia. In that respect, it's really good for the world that Trump is president instead of Hillary Clinton. Another foreign leader that shockingly, and this one may even be more shocking than Putin, in recent days has come out as voicing support for Trump is Bashar al-Assad in Syria. While this is good news, the reason it's so shocking is because al-Assad despises the Obama administration, accuses them of helping the enemy, basically because we're over there trying to eliminate him from power, accusing him of things. So it's no secret he wouldn't like us either. At the end of the day, it obviously remains to be seen how all this will play out. But in these respects, it seems to be a positive thing as far as the war on terror that Trump was elected president. Another global issue that needs attention as related to the president-elect's proposed policies is that of refugees. Naturally, this ties in with what we were just talking about. An increased military campaign will also cause the creation of more refugees trying to flee violence. That's just a natural repercussion of increased military activity. As we saw recently in a documentary for class, these are not bad people. The majority of them are just trying to live their life to the fullest, just the way you or I or any American citizen could expect to. However, it isn't only military action that will create more refugees. Trump's proposed actions and their potential effects on climate, as we discussed earlier, could potentially, years down the road, create thousands more climate refugees. And then, on top of that, creating more refugees, regardless of how you create them, is only half of the problem. Trump has shown time and time again a willingness to not grant asylum to these refugees that we're creating, either directly or indirectly. He has said that he wants to get rid of the thousands of Syrian refugees already residing here, escaping conflict in their home country. Now, that was on his campaign trail, though. His official stance from his 100-day plan is that he merely wants to revamp the entrance points for where refugees are coming into the country so that they can properly be screened for terror activity. Now, again, that's his official stance. He's said a few different things, but official, hardline, that's from his campaign. That's what they say. Again, how all of this is going to play out remains to be seen, but it is definitely going to have global implications one way or the other. One last thing I feel is worth mentioning, because number one, it's important, and number two, it's one aspect of Trump's campaign everyone is familiar with, his proposed policies dealing with Mexico. Obviously, anything dealing with a foreign nation will have global implications. Here, a big part of Trump's campaign, right from day one, as we've probably all heard, was all this talk of building the wall. Well, as it turns out in his 100-day plan, this is still a go. He has, since his election, slightly changed the proposal a little bit, due to realizing things like the astronomical cost of creating that many thousands of miles of wall out of concrete. Some places will just be a fence. Also, now he says he hopes that Mexico will reimburse us. Originally, he had said that Mexico would pay for the wall. Then he flip-flopped and said that they will reimburse us. Although, since he's been saying this, they've already come out and said that that is not going to happen. In Trump's defense here for this whole wall thing, we do need to improve our immigration strategies. That is a fact. The creation of this wall would make thousands of jobs, be it in construction of the wall itself or the Border Patrol to man it. One problem Ariana's stance on Mexico, though, is what to do with the illegals already here. As mentioned earlier, he wants to get rid of an Obama-enacted measure that protects the children of illegals that are already here. This, along with the wall, could create strains with the Mexican government, as well as create some questionable human rights activity. At the end of the day, no matter how this all plays out, one thing is for certain: a Trump presidency is going to have some effects on the world as a whole. Alright, and as I said, that part 4 was the last section here, so just to kind of bring it full circle, here's some concluding thoughts to end the presentation with. So what does all this mean? Well, again, I think it is worth mentioning that I only discussed a few of the many points outlined in President Trump's 100-day plan. The list goes on and on. You can feel free to log online. You can easily find it yourself. Also, things can and do frequently change. All this is dependent on things like cooperation from Congress, dissent or approval of the American people, a lot of things play into this. Overall, based on the points that I chose to discuss in this presentation, it appears Trump's proposals will overall be good for the American worker, for our infrastructure, and for our defense and military, things like that. It does not necessarily look good for Syria as a country as far as their refugee situation is concerned. I would say he's somewhere in the middle as far as international relations go. The reason I say he's somewhere in the middle as opposed to one side or the other is because while there's a lot of foreign leaders who have voiced support for him, not all of them have. There's a few more that are a little more hesitant. Also, such an eagerness to play around with nuclear arsenals like Donald Trump has shown might not sit too well with foreign leaders, might make people a little shaky, a little hesitant. Also, I can't stress enough to keep in mind that the points I made herein were based solely on Trump's official 100-day plan and some analysis and implications of that plan. Overall, though, I think it's still too early to say for certain on any of these issues or proposals or how it's all going to play out. One thing is absolutely certain, however, and that is that when there is new leadership in a country the scale of ours, the scale of the United States, anything he does is going to have a ripple effect throughout the rest of the world. That's simply the price we pay for living in an ever-increasingly globalized world, as we spent this semester learning about and discussing. At the end of the day, though, only time will tell. And that's it for me, and I want to thank you for taking the time to view my presentation.